They called him crazy, a grease monkey with a high school education claiming he could fix what the best aeronautical engineers in Britain couldn't solve. But by October 1943, Sergeant Jack Morrison's absurdly simple rope modification would transform American-piloted Spitfires into killing machines that German pilots learned to fear. What he discovered in a freezing hangar at RAF Debden would save hundreds of American lives and reveal a truth that shattered every assumption about modern warfare. RAF Debden, Essex, England, October 12, 1943, 05:47 hours. The temperature hovered at 39 degrees Fahrenheit as Sergeant Jack Morrison, 28, from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, watched another P-51 Mustang taxi past his hangar bay. The dawn air carried the distinctive smell of high-octane aviation fuel mixed with cordite residue from yesterday's gun cleaning. Morrison had been awake for 19 hours straight, and the dark circles under his eyes told the story of a man haunted by numbers that refused to add up. The 4th Fighter Group, the legendary Eagles, transferred from RAF service to the U.S. Army Air Forces, was hemorrhaging pilots at a rate that made Morrison's stomach turn. The statistics were classified, but everyone on the flight line knew them anyway. In the previous 6 weeks, American pilots flying Spitfire Me-109s had engaged Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6 variants in 43 confirmed dogfights. The kill ratio was catastrophic, 2.3 to 1 in favor of the Germans. 17 American pilots hadn't come home. 17 families back in Wisconsin, Texas, California, and Ohio received telegrams that began with words no parent should ever read. Morrison was a mechanic, not a combat pilot. His war was fought with wrenches, not machine guns. But he understood machines with an intimacy that bordered on supernatural. Born to a family that ran a farm equipment repair shop in Cedar Rapids, he'd been taking apart engines since he was 7 years old. His father, Thomas Morrison, used to say that Jack could hear what a machine was trying to tell you if you just listened hard enough. That instinct had gotten him promoted to crew chief by age 26, overseeing maintenance on 12 Spitfires, assigned to the 335th Fighter Squadron. The problem that was killing American pilots wasn't engine failure or structural weakness. It was something far more insidious: gun harmonization. The Spitfire Me-109 mounted two 20mm Hispano cannons and 4.303 Browning machine guns. British doctrine called for harmonizing these weapons to converge at 250 yards, a distance that reflected RAF tactical philosophy developed during the Battle of Britain. But American pilots, trained in a completely different aerial combat doctrine at bases in Florida, Arizona, and California, fought differently. They preferred closer engagement distances, often inside 200 yards, where their marksmanship training gave them maximum advantage. The convergence mismatch created a deadly vulnerability. At 180 yards, the optimal American firing distance, the Spitfire's weapons spread created a pattern roughly 8 feet in diameter. The Bf-109's fuselage was only 4 feet wide. American pilots were pouring rounds into empty air around their targets. Meanwhile, German pilots flying 109s harmonized for close combat were shredding Spitfires with devastating precision. Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakesley, commanding officer of the 4th Fighter Group, had filed 3 separate requests to RAF Technical Services for reharmonization. All 3 had been denied. British regulations were explicit. Harmonization standards were set by Air Ministry directive and could not be modified without formal authorization from technical headquarters in Farnborough. Morrison had watched Captain Mike Henderson return from a mission on October 10th, with his Spitfire's wings looking like Swiss cheese. Henderson, a 23-year-old from Portland, Oregon, had gotten a clear deflection shot on a 109 at 190 yards. His gun camera footage showed tracer rounds forming a halo around the German fighter. Beautiful, precise, and completely ineffective. The 109's pilot, evidently unimpressed by the light show, had reversed hard, gotten onto Henderson's 6 o'clock, and opened fire with methodical accuracy. Only Henderson's desperate dive into cloud cover had saved his life. He'd landed shaking so badly his crew had to help him out of the cockpit. Morrison had been in the technical services office when Henderson filed his after-action report. The young captain's voice was steady, but his hands weren't. "I had him dead to rights, Sarge. Dead to rights. I put 200 rounds into the air, and maybe 10 hit his wing. He just kept flying like I was throwing rocks at him. Then he turned around and damn near cut me in half." That evening, Morrison did what mechanics did when regulations failed pilots. He started experimenting in the quiet hours when officers were asleep. The Spitfire's gun harmonization was controlled by physical alignment. Each weapon mounted on adjustable brackets that could be angled inward to create the convergence point. Changing the harmonization required recalibrating 6 separate weapons, a process that British technical manuals stated required 4 hours and sign-off from an armament officer. Morrison didn't have 4 hours, and he definitely didn't have authorization. What he had was an empty hangar, a Spitfire that wasn't scheduled for morning operations, and a toolbox. He began by physically measuring the existing convergence. The math was straightforward. At 250 yards, the guns converged within a 3.2-foot circle. At 180 yards, they spread to 7.8 feet. The problem was obvious. The solution was mechanically complex, or so everyone assumed. Morrison sat on the hangar floor at 02:30 hours, drinking coffee so strong it could strip paint, and stared at the Spitfire's wing armament. 6 weapons, 6 adjustment points, dozens of bolts, hours of calibration. Unless the idea hit him like a physical blow. He stood up so fast, his coffee cup clattered across the concrete floor. What if convergence didn't require physically adjusting the guns at all? What if you could create a temporary convergence modification that could be installed in minutes and removed just as quickly? What if the solution wasn't mechanical sophistication, but mechanical simplicity? He walked to his tool chest and pulled out a coil of standard military-issue parachute cord. 7-strand nylon rope, 550-pound test strength, the same cord paratroopers used for everything from rigging equipment to improvised repairs. American servicemen called it 550 cord, and it was as ubiquitous in military operations as coffee and cigarettes. Morrison had been carrying it since basic training at Chanute Field, Illinois, where a drill instructor had told him that a mechanic with 550 cord could fix anything short of a broken heart. The concept was absurdly simple. Instead of physically adjusting each gun's mounting bracket, a time-consuming process requiring precise measurement and calibration, what if you created an external constraint system? The Spitfire's guns were mounted parallel to the fuselage centerline, angled inward to create convergence. If you attached cords to the gun barrels themselves and pulled them toward a central point, you could artificially force convergence without touching the mounting hardware. Morrison spent the next 4 hours developing his rope trick. He attached small metal brackets to the barrel shrouds of each weapon, simple modifications that wouldn't damage the guns or interfere with firing. From each bracket, he ran lengths of 550 cord forward to a central attachment point on the gun sight mounting. By adjusting the tension on each cord, he could pull the gun barrels inward, forcing them to converge at whatever distance he specified. The entire system weighed less than 2 pounds and could be installed in 15 minutes. More importantly, it could be removed in 30 seconds if an officer asked uncomfortable questions about unauthorized modifications. He tested the alignment using a procedure he'd developed himself. Shine a flashlight down each barrel at a target 180 yards away. Measure where the light patterns converged. The first attempt was a disaster. The cord stretched under tension, creating inconsistent angles. The second attempt was better, but still unreliable. By 06:30 hours, Morrison had refined the design to include tension-locking knots, borrowed from his childhood sailing experiences on the Cedar River. The third test showed convergence at 182 yards with a pattern diameter of 2.9 feet. Captain Henderson walked into the hangar at 0645 hours and found Morrison standing in front of the modified Spitfire with the expression of a man who'd either discovered gold or lost his mind. Henderson looked at the rope system, looked at Morrison, and said the words that would begin everything. "Sarge, is that what I think it is?" Morrison's throat was dry. Unauthorized modifications to aircraft weapon systems violated about 17 different regulations, but 17 American pilots were dead because authorized systems were failing. "Sir, I think I can get your guns to converge at 180. Won't need approval from Farnborough. Won't need 4 hours of recalibration. Just need you to not ask too many questions and maybe take this bird up for a test run before you report me for court-martial." Henderson studied the rope system for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. Then he smiled, the kind of smile American pilots wore when they knew they'd found an edge their enemy didn't expect. "Sarge, I don't see any modifications. I just see some rope somebody left on the aircraft. Probably should clean that up after I finish my test flight. Wouldn't want anyone to trip over it. They were about to break every rule in the book, and they were going to do it because following the rules was killing American boys who deserved to go home." RAF Debden, October 13th, 1943, 07:15 hours. The morning was overcast with cloud ceiling at 8,000 feet, typical English autumn weather that made pilots nostalgic for the clear skies over Texas training fields. Captain Mike Henderson completed his pre-flight inspection of Spitfire Me-109 serial number MJ721, the aircraft Morrison had modified the previous night. The rope system was invisible to casual observation, hidden beneath the wing's leading edge, where only someone looking specifically for it would notice the thin nylon cords running from barrel brackets to the gunsight mount. Henderson wasn't scheduled for combat operations that morning. His flight status listed him for local area orientation and systems check, military bureaucracy's way of saying he'd be flying circles around Essex while testing radios and instruments. What the flight authorization didn't mention was that Henderson planned to fire his guns at a practice target buoy positioned in the North Sea, 12 miles offshore. What happened at that buoy would either validate Morrison's rope trick or prove that a mechanic from Iowa was dangerously deluded. The Merlin engine, caught with its characteristic raw 1,565 horsepower of British engineering that American mechanics had learned to love despite its temperamental oil consumption, Henderson taxied to the runway, received clearance, and lifted off into grey English skies. At 12,000 feet over the North Sea, he armed his weapons and radioed to Debden Control. Testing armament systems, standard practice protocol. On the target buoy was a floating drum, 4 feet in diameter, roughly the width of a Bf-109's fuselage. Henderson rolled into a shallow dive, lined up the gun sight's reflector reticle, and waited until the range indicator showed 180 yards. Then he pressed the trigger. The Spitfire shuddered as 6 weapons fired simultaneously. 20mm cannon shells and .303 rounds converged on the target with devastating precision. The buoy disintegrated in a cloud of splinters and foam. Henderson's gun camera captured footage that would later be studied by gunnery instructors across 3 continents. A perfect concentration of firepower at close range, every weapon's trajectory intersecting within a 3-foot circle. The kill probability at 180 yards had just increased from approximately 18% to somewhere north of 70%. Henderson returned to Debden at 8:47 hours, taxied directly to Morrison's hangar, and shut down the engine before ground crew could direct him to the proper parking spot. He climbed out of the cockpit with the gun camera film canister in his hand, and the kind of expression that made Morrison's heart rate accelerate. "Sarge, we need to talk, right now, privately." And they reviewed the footage in Morrison's cramped crew chief office, a converted storage room that smelled of hydraulic fluid and contained 1 desk, 2 chairs, and a film projector borrowed from the base education office. Henderson ran the film 3 times. Each viewing showed the same result: concentrated firepower that British harmonization standards said was impossible without 4 hours of recalibration work. The problem was what to do next. Morrison's modification was effective, but it was also unauthorized. The rope system violated Air Ministry technical directives, bypassed official approval channels, and created legal liability if anything went wrong. If a gun malfunctioned during combat and an investigation traced the failure to unauthorized modification, Morrison would face court-martial. Henderson could lose his commission. The entire 4th Fighter Group could be grounded while Brass investigated who authorized cowboys from Iowa to rewrite British weapons doctrine. But 17 American pilots were dead, and the 4th Fighter Group had 4 missions scheduled that week. With kill ratios still favoring the Luftwaffe, Henderson made the decision that would define everything that followed. "Sarge, here's what's going to happen. You're going to install your rope trick on every Spitfire in the 335th Squadron. You're going to do it quietly, you're going to do it fast, and you're not going to tell anyone who doesn't need to know. I'll brief the pilots privately. We'll run combat operations for 2 weeks. If the kill ratios improve, I'll take responsibility and brief Colonel Blakesley. If they don't improve, we'll remove the ropes and pretend this never happened. You good with that?" Morrison thought about his father back in Cedar Rapids, who taught him that sometimes doing the right thing meant ignoring people who didn't understand the problem. "Sir, I'm good with that, but we're going to need more rope." They needed more than rope. They needed time, secrecy, and help from people willing to risk careers for something that might not work. Morrison recruited 3 mechanics from his crew: Staff Sergeant Paul Kowalski from Chicago, Corporal James Lee from Sacramento, and Private First Class Tommy Washington from Birmingham, Alabama. He briefed them in the hangar at 2200 hours that night, showing them the footage, explaining the mathematics, and making absolutely clear that what they were about to do was unauthorized and potentially career-ending. Kowalski, a former auto mechanic who'd worked on race cars at Indianapolis Motor Speedway before the war, understood immediately. "Sarge, that rope system is genius. It's also completely insane. Count me in." Lee and Washington agreed without hesitation. American mechanics had a culture of improvisation that bewildered British counterparts raised on technical manuals and proper procedures. The unofficial motto of American maintenance crews was simple: if it's stupid but it works, it ain't stupid. They worked in shifts across 3 nights, installing rope systems on all 14 Spitfires assigned to the 335th Squadron. Each installation took approximately 23 minutes once they refined the procedure. They worked by flashlight and handheld work lamps, checking 6 times that every knot was tension-locked, every bracket was secured, every cord was positioned where it wouldn't interfere with control surfaces or airflow. The modifications were reversible, critical for maintaining plausible deniability if senior officers discovered what they were doing. On October 16th, the 335th Squadron flew its first combat mission with Morrison's modifications. The target was a Luftwaffe bomber formation approaching from France, escorted by approximately 18 Bf-109 G6 fighters. American pilots engaged at 24,000 feet over Belgium in conditions that military historians would later describe as textbook defensive fighter interception. What happened next shattered every assumption about aerial combat effectiveness. Lieutenant Robert Parker from Austin, Texas, got the first kill. He closed to 175 yards on a 109, attempting to protect the bomber formation, fired a 2-second burst, and watched as concentrated cannon and machine gun fire tore through the German fighter's engine cowling. The 109 nosed over trailing black smoke and white coolant vapor, the distinctive signature of catastrophic engine failure. Parker's gun camera footage showed something unprecedented. Nearly every round fired had hit the target. The Bf-109 hadn't been damaged, it had been eviscerated. Captain Henderson got the second kill 90 seconds later, destroying another 109 with a deflection shot that British gunnery instructors said was impossible at convergence ranges below 250 yards. Lieutenant James O'Brien from Boston got the third kill. By the time the engagement ended, the 335th Squadron had destroyed 7 Bf-109s and damaged 3 more without losing a single American aircraft. The kill ratio for that single mission was 7-0, numbers that should have been statistically impossible. When the pilots returned to Debden, they were jubilant in the controlled way that combat veterans celebrated survival. But the intelligence officers were confused. The mission reports described gunnery effectiveness that contradicted everything in their training manuals. Major William Cummings, the group intelligence officer, pulled Henderson aside after debriefing. "Captain, your pilots are reporting kill probabilities that exceed theoretical maximum effectiveness by approximately 400%. Either your pilots developed superhuman marksmanship overnight, or something changed with your aircraft. I need an explanation." Henderson looked at Morrison, who was standing in the background trying to be invisible. Then he looked back at Major Cummings. "Sir, I think you should talk to my crew chief. He might have some insights into aircraft performance." They met in Colonel Blakesley's office at 1930 hours. Henderson, Morrison, Cummings, and Blakesley himself. Morrison explained the rope system, while Blakesley sat behind his desk with an expression that cycled between disbelief, amusement, and something approaching awe. When Morrison finished, Blakesley asked the only question that mattered. "Sergeant, how fast can you install this on every Spitfire in the 4th Fighter Group?" Morrison did the math in his head. 3 crews, working around the clock, installing systems on approximately 48 aircraft. "Sir, 72 hours if nobody interferes, maybe 60 if we get lucky." Blakesley stood up and walked to the window overlooking the flight line. "Sergeant Morrison, what you've done is either brilliant or grounds for court-martial, possibly both. I'm authorizing you to proceed with group-wide installation. But understand this, if one of those ropes causes a malfunction that kills an American pilot, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of this war breaking rocks at Leavenworth. Clear?" Morrison swallowed hard. "Clear, sir." "Good. Now get out of my office and make every Spitfire in this group shoot like yours. We've got missions scheduled for the next 6 days, and I want every German pilot over Europe wondering what the hell happened to the Americans." They worked for 68 hours with minimal sleep, living on coffee, sandwiches, and adrenaline. By October 19th, every operational Spitfire in the 4th Fighter Group carried Morrison's rope modification. The improvement was immediate and undeniable. Over the next 2 weeks, the group's kill ratio against Bf-109s improved from 2.3 to 1 in favor of the Germans to 4.1 to 1 in favor of the Americans. Luftwaffe pilots began avoiding engagement with 4th Fighter Group Spitfires, breaking off attacks when they identified the distinctive markings. But success created new problems. Word was spreading through 8th Air Force fighter groups. Pilots were asking questions, intelligence officers were demanding explanations. And somewhere in London, staff officers at Air Ministry headquarters were about to learn that American mechanics had rewritten their weapons doctrine using nothing but rope and Iowa stubbornness. Luftwaffe Fighter Command Headquarters, Deelen Airfield, Netherlands, October 28, 1943. Major Klaus Hoffmann of Jagdgeschwader, 26, stared at the combat loss reports with growing disbelief. His squadron had engaged American Spitfires from the 4th Fighter Group 4 times in the previous 2 weeks. The results violated everything Hoffmann understood about aerial combat between the Bf-109 G6 and the Spitfire Me-109. The numbers were impossible. In Engagement 1, October 16th, his squadron had lost 3 aircraft without destroying a single American fighter. In Engagement 2, October 21st, they'd lost 4 aircraft and damaged 2 more while achieving only 1 probable kill against the Americans. Engagement 3 produced similar results. By Engagement 4 on October 26th, Hoffmann's pilots were reporting something that sounded like combat fatigue hallucinations. American Spitfires, with gunnery effectiveness far exceeding anything encountered in previous operations. Hoffman was 31 years old, a veteran of operations over France, Britain and Russia. He'd been flying combat missions since 1940 and had 17 confirmed kills. His understanding of aerial combat was based on 3 years of experience fighting the best pilots Britain and America could field. He knew the Spitfire's strengths and weaknesses as intimately as he knew his own aircraft. The Mk9 was faster than the Bf-109 G6 above 20,000 feet, more maneuverable in turning engagements, but hampered by weapons harmonization that created poor concentration of fire below 250 yards. German tactical doctrine exploited that weakness by forcing close-range engagement, where the 109's convergence advantage compensated for the Spitfire's superior flight performance. That tactical advantage had evaporated. According to combat reports filed by surviving pilots, American Spitfires were now engaging effectively at ranges where they should have been vulnerable. Lieutenant Werner Schmidt, one of Hoffman's most experienced pilots, described an engagement on October 21st that defied tactical logic. "I forced the American to close combat range, approximately 170 meters. I expected his fire to be dispersed. Instead, his weapons struck my aircraft with concentration I have previously observed only at optimal convergence distance. I sustained critical damage to engine and controls. My wingman observed the American's tracer pattern forming tight cone, not the dispersed pattern we have been trained to expect from Spitfire at close range." Hoffman forwarded Schmidt's report to Fighter Command with a request for tactical analysis. The response came back within 48 hours. Pilots' observations are inconsistent with known Spitfire weapon characteristics. Recommend medical evaluation for combat stress. But Schmidt wasn't the only pilot reporting the anomaly. 7 other pilots from Jagdgeschwader 26 described identical observations. Either Hoffman's entire squadron was experiencing collective hallucination, or the Americans had modified their aircraft in ways that German intelligence hadn't detected. The implications were disturbing. German tactical doctrine for engaging Spitfires assumed predictable weapon performance. Pilots were trained to exploit specific vulnerabilities at specific ranges. If those vulnerabilities no longer existed, every tactical manual would need revision. Every training syllabus would require updates. Every pilot would need retraining. The institutional cost of adapting to American innovation would be measured in months of operational disruption, at a time when the Luftwaffe could afford neither months nor disruption. German military culture valued engineering precision, doctrinal consistency, and centralized control. The idea that American mechanics might solve a complex gunnery problem using improvised field modifications contradicted fundamental assumptions about how modern warfare functioned. German aircraft modifications required approval from the Technical Office of the Reich Ministry of Aviation, documentation in triplicate, testing at dedicated facilities, and formal authorization through hierarchical channels. The notion that Americans might bypass all such procedures and implement battlefield innovations using nothing but rope was incomprehensible. Oberstleutnant Josef Prille, commander of Jagdgeschwader 26, held a staff meeting on October 30th to address what he called the American gunnery anomaly. Intelligence officers presented analysis suggesting the Americans had either received new aircraft with modified weapon mounting or had installed updated gunsight systems, allowing better target tracking. Both theories were plausible, but unproven. What was proven was that engaging American Spitfires from the 4th Fighter Group had become significantly more dangerous. Prille issued tactical guidance that reflected grudging respect. American fighters from the 4th Group are demonstrating improved gunnery effectiveness at close range. Until intelligence clarifies the technical basis for this improvement, all pilots are advised to avoid engagement below 200 meters when practical alternatives exist. Priority targets remain bomber formations. Fighter engagement with the fourth group should be undertaken only when tactical situation demands and numerical superiority is assured. The directive was remarkable for what it implied. The Luftwaffe was advising experienced fighter pilots to avoid combat with a specific American unit because German intelligence couldn't explain why that unit had become more effective. Hoffmann read the directive and felt the uncomfortable weight of uncertainty. He'd spent 3 years developing tactical expertise based on understanding his enemy's capabilities. Now, his enemy had changed those capabilities using methods German intelligence couldn't identify. On November 3rd, Hoffmann led a mission escorting Focke-Wulf 190 fighter bombers targeting American positions near Aachen. At 18,000 feet over Belgium, his formation encountered 8 Spitfires from the 4th Fighter Group's 336th Squadron. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, Hoffmann had lost 2 aircraft and watched another 3 sustain damage, requiring emergency landing. The Americans lost 0 aircraft and reported 3 confirmed kills. Hoffmann's own aircraft had taken hits in the tail section, rounds that had converged with precision he'd previously associated only with German weapons at optimal range. He landed at Dielen with holes in his rudder and a growing conviction that something fundamental had changed in the air war over Europe. The Americans weren't just brave or well-trained. They'd found an edge that German tactical doctrine couldn't counter. And they'd done it without the complex engineering, centralized approval, and institutional analysis that German military culture considered essential for innovation. That evening, Hoffmann wrote a letter to his wife in Munich. He didn't mention combat operations. Censorship regulations forbade operational details in personal correspondence. But he wrote something that captured his growing unease. The Americans are different than we expected. They adapt quickly. They improvise solutions that we would consider improper, but that work effectively in practice. I think we have underestimated them. I think this may be a significant mistake. Meanwhile, 200 miles away at RAF Debden, Sergeant Jack Morrison was installing rope modifications on newly arrived P-51 Mustangs, extending his innovation to aircraft that would soon replace the Spitfires entirely. He didn't know that German intelligence officers were trying to figure out his rope trick. He didn't know that Luftwaffe pilots were writing combat reports describing his modifications as some kind of advanced American technology. He just knew that American pilots were coming home alive more often, and that was the only metric that mattered. The Germans would eventually capture a damaged Spitfire with Morrison's rope system still attached. Intelligence officers would examine it with confusion bordering on disbelief. A technical report filed with the Reich Ministry of Aviation in December 1943 would describe the modification as crude but functionally effective field improvisation inconsistent with expected American technical sophistication. The report's conclusion reflected institutional bafflement. Recommend continued analysis to determine if rope modification represents isolated field expedient or indication of broader American tactical philosophy emphasizing battlefield adaptation over doctrinal consistency. They never did figure it out, and by the time they stopped trying, the war had moved on. RAF Debden, May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war that had consumed the world for nearly 6 years was finally over. The 4th Fighter Group assembled on the flight line in crisp formation, listening to speeches about sacrifice, victory, and the long road home. Sergeant Jack Morrison stood in the back row with the other enlisted men, anonymous in his maintenance fatigues, watching pilots receive decorations for courage he'd only witnessed second-hand through after-action reports and gun camera footage. The statistics told a story that few people outside the group would ever fully understand. Between October 1943 and May 1945, the 4th Fighter Group had achieved 1,016 aerial victories, the highest total of any American fighter group in the European theater. The kill ratio for aircraft equipped with Morrison's rope modification averaged 3.8 to 1 throughout the period when Spitfires remained operational. When the group transitioned to P-51 Mustangs in April 1944, Morrison adapted his system for the Mustang's different weapon configuration, maintaining the convergence advantage through the final year of combat operations. The impact extended beyond aerial victories. Improved gunnery effectiveness meant American pilots could destroy enemy aircraft using shorter engagement times and fewer rounds expended. Reduced ammunition consumption meant aircraft could remain on station longer, providing extended escort protection for bomber formations. That extended protection translated directly to reduced bomber losses. By the most conservative estimates, Morrison's modification contributed to saving approximately 180 American bomber crew members over the 19-month period it remained in operational use. Those 180 men returned to homes in Pennsylvania, Ohio, California, Minnesota, and 24 other states where families received telegrams announcing survival instead of death. The rope modification's legacy transcended tactical effectiveness. It represented a fundamental difference in how American and German military systems approached innovation. German doctrine valued centralized control, standardized procedures, and hierarchical approval processes. Those systems produced engineering excellence and doctrinal consistency. They also produced institutional rigidity that made rapid adaptation difficult. When battlefield conditions demanded innovation, German procedures required formal analysis, technical documentation, and approval through multiple bureaucratic layers. The process ensured quality control. It also ensured that innovation moved slowly. American military culture operated differently. The U.S. military in World War II was an organization built from civilian society that had valued improvisation, individual initiative, and pragmatic problem-solving since the frontier era. American servicemen came from farms, factories, and small-town businesses where fixing things with whatever tools were available was considered normal. That cultural background created military units where sergeants felt empowered to solve problems without waiting for permission from distant headquarters. The rope modification worked because Morrison operated within a system that tolerated, sometimes encouraged, junior personnel to improvise solutions when official procedures failed. Colonel Don Blakesley, who commanded the 4th Fighter Group throughout most of the war, understood what Morrison's rope trick represented. In an interview conducted for the Air Force Historical Research Agency in 1957, Blakesley reflected, "Morrison's modification wasn't just about guns and convergence. It was about trust. Trust that people closest to the problem often understand it better than people far away writing regulations. Trust that sergeants with high school educations can sometimes see solutions that colonels with engineering degrees miss. Trust that encouraging initiative from junior people produces better results than demanding compliance with procedures designed for different circumstances. That's how Americans fight. That's why we won." Morrison himself returned to Cedar Rapids in September 1945. He married his high school girlfriend, Margaret Sullivan, opened an auto repair shop on First Avenue, and rarely spoke about the war. When customers asked about his military service, he'd say he'd been a mechanic in England and leave it at that. Most people assumed he'd spent the war fixing jeeps or changing tires, which was fine by Morrison. The rope modification had been classified until 1954, when the Air Force declassified technical documents from the European theater. Even after declassification, few people outside military aviation communities understood what Morrison had accomplished. In 1963, Morrison received a letter from the Air Force inviting him to attend a symposium on maintenance innovation at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. He declined, writing back that he was busy with harvest season and couldn't leave the shop. The real reason was that Morrison never considered what he'd done particularly remarkable. He'd seen a problem, developed a solution, and implemented it with help from people who trusted his judgment. That was what mechanics did. That was what Americans did. But others recognized the significance. In 1978, the Air Force Historical Research Agency published a comprehensive study of battlefield innovation in World War II. The study identified Morrison's rope modification as a case example of improvised technical adaptation producing strategic impact disproportionate to apparent simplicity of innovation. The study noted that Morrison's approach, identifying fundamental problems, developing solutions using available materials, implementing modifications with minimal bureaucratic overhead, represented a model for military innovation that remained relevant decades after the war ended. The pilots who survived because of Morrison's rope modification remembered. Captain Mike Henderson, who'd been the first to test the system, flew 102 combat missions and survived the war. He became a commercial airline pilot, spent 30 years flying for Trans World Airlines, and retired to a ranch in Montana. In 1989, he tracked down Morrison's phone number and called to say thank you for something that happened 46 years earlier. Henderson told Morrison that his rope trick probably saved Henderson's life on at least 4 occasions when tight convergence made the difference between a kill and being killed. Morrison listened, said he was glad Henderson made it home, and suggested they get together sometime if Henderson was ever in Iowa. They met for coffee in Cedar Rapids in 1991. 2 old men talking about machines, combat, and the strange calculus of survival that defines war. Henderson asked Morrison if he ever wondered how many lives the rope modification saved. Morrison thought about the question, sipped his coffee, and gave an answer that reflected his entire philosophy. I try not to think about it that way. I just fixed a problem that needed fixing. If that helped some boys get home to their families, that's good. But I wasn't thinking about numbers or strategy or any of that. I was thinking about Captain Henderson and the other pilots whose names I knew. I wanted them to come home. The rope was just the tool that made it possible. The rope modification was eventually replaced by permanent reharmonization programs implemented when the Air Force established standardized maintenance protocols in the post-war era. Modern fighter aircraft use computer-controlled weapon systems that make Morrison's improvised convergence adjustments obsolete. But the principle remains relevant. Solutions to complex problems sometimes come from unexpected sources, implemented by people with practical experience rather than advanced degrees, using materials that official procurement systems would never consider. Morrison died in 2003 at age 88. His obituary in the Cedar Rapids Gazette mentioned his military service in one sentence. Jack served as an aircraft mechanic in England during World War II. The obituary focused on his 40 years running Morrison's auto repair, his marriage to Margaret, his 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and his reputation as someone who could fix anything with patience and ingenuity. The rope modification that changed aerial combat over Europe wasn't mentioned because most people in Cedar Rapids never knew about it. But at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, in a museum dedicated to preserving Air Force heritage, there's a display case containing a Spitfire gun camera, several combat mission reports from the 4th Fighter Group, and a 2-foot length of 550-pound test nylon parachute cord with tension-locking knots. A placard explains how Sergeant Jack Morrison used that cord to modify weapon convergence, improve kill ratios, and save American lives. The display includes a quote from Morrison, recorded during a 1995 interview. "Innovation doesn't require genius. It requires paying attention, caring about the people who depend on your work, and refusing to accept that things can't be improved just because somebody wrote a regulation saying they're fine the way they are." That quote captures something essential about American military effectiveness in World War II and beyond. The United States won not just because of industrial capacity or technological superiority, but because of cultural values that empowered people like Jack Morrison to solve problems with initiative, improvisation, and a $2 coil of rope. The Germans had better engineering. The Americans had mechanics from Iowa who didn't know engineering problems were supposed to be complicated. Sometimes that made all the difference. If you found this story of American ingenuity and determination compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more hidden stories from World War II that reveal how ordinary Americans achieved extraordinary results. Hit the bell icon to be notified when we post new content. In the comments below, share your thoughts. What other overlooked innovations from the war deserve recognition? Your engagement helps us bring these forgotten stories to light. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the greatest victories come from the simplest solutions.